Welcome to Western Civ, episode 233, Painting with a Broad Brush. Last time we covered the basics of Mayan civilization. We talked about their political views, religious outlook, and generally how they structured their society from a cultural perspective. We needed to know all this so that we could learn a bit about the Maya from a purely political history perspective. Today, I'm going to paint, however, with very broad strokes. The sad reality remains that we have very little from the Maya in terms of traditional political history. What I mean by that is political history written in the Western tradition, a la Herodotus. Now, that doesn't mean that said political history never existed. The reality is that we have only a fraction of the documents written by the Maya. Everything that was not recorded on stone is by and large gone. And think for a second about the amount of material that would not exist today from ancient Greece or Rome if all we had were things chiseled on some pillar somewhere. It wouldn't be much. Some of this has to do with the environment of the Yucatan. Papyrus does not rot in the dry sands of Egypt. Bark paper absolutely does in the jungle. Plus, can't forget that the Spaniards destroyed anything they could get their hands on when they snuffed out any remaining Mayan culture in the 16th and early 17th centuries. So, to an extent, our lack of sources is intentional. What all this means for you is that what you're about to hear is the extreme Cliff Notes version of Mayan history. I'm going to keep the names to an absolute minimum because many of them are very similar, and I don't want to bog down the entire episode. That being said, I do want to give you at least some sense of how the Maya rose, plateaued, and fell. Also, please be cognizant that in terms of political history, we are going to talk about a series of what I am going to call city-states, since that is what their political organization most closely resembles. The Maya were never a unified empire. We can talk about the Maya as one culture, because all these different political entities shared a common culture. That does not mean that they were ever under one political umbrella. They weren't. So, with all that being said, let's talk about the Maya. If we judge the Maya by our definition of progress, they had few technological wonders. They had few metal tools. They had no beasts of burden. Yet, they had an incredibly complex social hierarchy. The first key engine that kickstarted the Maya pre-classical age was the invention of kingship. This invention allowed the Maya to harness the available social energy, the one real untapped resource at their disposal. They invented political symbols, which transformed and coordinated age-old institutions, such as the family, the village shaman, and the patriarchy. Our social institutions today seem like such mundane parts of our lives that we sometimes forget that these too, at one point, were inventions. In the brief space of a century, the Maya infused their world with a novel concept, the Ahau, or High King. At the dawn of the pre-classical age, trade had massively increased between the different Maya city-states, as well as some regions of southern Mexico. But the newfound wealth that came as a result of this trade was not evenly distributed. The uneven distribution of said wealth resulted in the usual social strife. Moreover, the innovation of new agricultural techniques, while superior, required massive amounts of labor that the existing Maya institutions were having a hard time organizing. Kingship was a way to solve these problems. The invention of the Oahu was a way for the noble class to explain away growing social inequalities. They made no effort to eliminate the inequalities. Instead, what the Maya did was figure out a way to build them into the fabric of their society. The Oahu was all about unity. Through him, the people had a conduit to the sacred, to the underworld. The Oahu was also highly skilled. The people firmly believed that he existed for their benefit. He could make advantageous trade deals that would benefit everyone, albeit some people more than others. He could read the stars and hence the future. He knew when it was time to declare war and when it was time to make peace. It only made sense, therefore, for him to have the trappings of kingship. But kings needed symbols for their power. The greatest symbol by far was the pyramid. Many of these can still be seen today in the Yucatan. And it was also through the great pyramid structures they built that the Maya would commune with the dead. Building these pyramids were quite the undertaking. To begin their task, the builders would lay the foundation of the new temple and a plaza in a layer upon layer of white earth, soft lime marl underlying the hard capstone of the Yucatan. This was really sort of a common material. People used it to build platforms and patios of everything from storehouses to even residencies. Then, all the builders and the elders of the community shattered precious pottery vessels, both the work of local craftspeople and pots obtained from trade, and mixed the shards of these into the white earth. To this earth and pottery, they added the flowers of fruit trees from their own orchards, which surrounded the new town. From the foundation upward, the people made this building not only for, but with devout and sacred action. With the ritual of the beginning ended, the builders then laid down a pavement of flat, hard stones upon layers of the white earth. They raised a broad platform that would hold both the temple and its plaza. Within this platform, masons built a lattice of internal walls that would buttress the internal fill to keep it from spreading as the upper structures were built upon it. The spaces between these walls were then filled with vast quantities of coarse, broken limestone, which laborers hauled up from nearby pits that had been driven down to excavate. When they finally finished the platform, the laborers capped the top of it with soft, white lime earth, into which they mixed more pottery, broken down in rituals of devotion and dedication. Upon this surface, the master builders then drew the outline of the temple, which was in the shape of a giant T. The stem of this T represented a long stairway, beginning from the bottom of the pyramid and extending southward onto the raised plaza, which constituted then the arms of the T. Following this outline, the builders would raise the temple and its stairway simultaneously, an effort of master builders, masons, and laborers drawn from the community, coordinated by the ruler and his counselors. The temple platform rose in the form of a steep pyramid with smooth outer walls made of small, loaf-shaped blocks. The master builders carefully calculated the proportions of the pyramid in advance in order to accommodate the long stairway and the dimensions of the 4 elaborately decorated panels which would be mounted on the main and southern side of the building facing the new plaza. While the builders built up the rubble core of the pyramid, masons fashioned 4 deep well-like holes, which were placed symmetrically to the left and right of the north-south axis. These holes would contain the great trees of the 4 directions that would soar above the thatched roof of the temple. When the front face of the pyramid approached its full height, master masons were called in to cut and lay special stones that would function as the armatures of the great masks and ear ornaments which would be modeled on the 2 upper panels. While some masons worked on these upper panels, others supervised the construction of the stairway, which linked the temple at the summit to the plaza below. The stairway had to be much longer than simple practicality required, for it contained two broad landings, one in the middle of the stairway and one at the threshold of the summit temple. During ritual, the king would pause on the middle and the top landings to perform a dance and carry out sacrifice in view of the followers on the plaza below. 4 stairs led to the first landing and 9 to the summit of the threshold. These sacred numbers dictated the length of the entire staircase. Now, at some point in the construction, the master builder had to pause and consult with the king, the patriarchs, and the shamans. The king had a particular decorative program in mind for this building, and he had to follow that program in every respect. The tricky part of the design was about to commence: the building of the front walls and the lower terraces. These walls, like the panels already established on the pyramid face above, would ultimately house great giant masks. The builders had to establish where to construct the retaining walls of the lower terraces, so that the king, when standing in the middle of the landing, would appear to sit in the very center of these 4 great masks. In the next phase of construction, masons would make adjustments to the final proportions by sight. While they were working with the stone, woodworkers shaped the massive tree trunks that would fit in 4 sockets in the floor of the summit temple, 4 to represent the 4 directions. The masons then raised the floor of the temple proper by about a foot to create the necessary 2 levels at the top. Then the skilled artisans finished the job. Working quickly with plaster before it set, the artisans built out the various sculptures that would adorn the walls of the temple. Because they had to work so fast, these men had to know exactly what the final product was going to look like before they started. While the plaster was still damp, they then added the pigments, red, pink, black, and yellow, to highlight the natural cream of the plaster. To finish on time, they needed to work frantically, with drips from the brushes simply being incorporated into the art itself. We know that these images were designed to be read like a story, but in terms of actual written script, there's almost none. At least almost none survives. Not everyone in the Maya world was literate, of course, far from it. But everyone in the community, from the Ahau to the lowliest farmer, understood the story these images told. Just like with the Egyptian pyramids, scholars believed the work on the Maya temples were an act of devotion. And I talk about these pyramid structures because if you go to the Yucatan today, these are the enduring symbols of the Maya. To imagine what the craftsmanship must have been like 1,500 years ago strikes you in awe, just as when you gaze upon the pyramids of Egypt. By around 600 BCE, the peoples who lived around today, what is called Tikal, began putting down roots to establish an agricultural community. We know little about these early people, but we do know that they prospered. By the 2nd century BCE, they had begun to push into the territory today of what we might call downtown Tikal. Even then, a class of nobility had begun to develop. We know this from the burial remains, both because of what these people were buried with and the bones themselves, which were more robust, indicating these were healthier humans than the other poorer classes of people. During the 1st century BCE, these nobles began the process of what we might call remodeling Tikal's ceremonial space. The labor cost to do all this must have been enormous. As a result, I think it's fair to infer that the elite in Tikal had begun the process of moving from a tribal, subsistence-based society to something much more sophisticated. During this period, Tikal was consistently vying for supremacy in what is today Guatemala with Yucatan, a nearby Mayan city-state. Clearly, both sites shared a similar culture, because all the imagery and architecture is the same. Throughout this period, however, neither was able to gain a great advantage over the other. Tikal was ruled by a single dynasty from early classic times right down to its ultimate collapse in the 9th century of the Common Era. Its historic founder, who likely did exist, was Yakhmogin. He ruled from 219 CE until 228. Yakhmogin is actually the earliest example in the Americas of a quote-unquote anchoring ancestor. Somebody who a people derive kind of a shared common ancestry, which is oftentimes apocryphal. Think of somebody like Aeneas for Rome. Also present in many inscriptions honoring Yakhmogin is the idea of the war captive. The Maya waged war not to kill people, but to capture them. Their gods demanded a constant stream of blood sacrifice. As a result, war captives were never taken for ransom. They were intended from the moment of their capture to be physical gifts to the gods. The more royal the captive, the better the offering. The rivalry between Tikal and Yucatan really heats up during the reign of an important Tikal, Ahau. His name was Great Jaguar Paw. He came to the throne between 320 and 376 CE, and he changed the nature of Mayan warfare forever. During his reign, Tikal became the dominant city-state in the region. The dates we have of consequence, however, only come from the last several years of his reign. Warfare was not new to the Maya, as I mentioned, but it followed a very scripted and ceremonial structure. Fighting was hand-to-hand. There were the traditional exchanges of insults, boasts of heroism, etc., just as there were if we look in the Iliad. Then the two sides fought for captives. But crucially, when the battle was over, the two sides just went home. Nobody conquered anybody. Great Jaguar Paw changed this. His was a war of conquest, and he won it on January the 16th, 378. The two key players in this drama are Great Jaguar Paw and his lead general, Smoking Frog, who was likely related to him. In the different images that survived, Great Jaguar Paw is illustrated differently. Previously, kings looked on the battlefield like they did on the ceremonial temple steps. But now his costume looks totally different, and the message is clear. This is a war of conquest. This epic battle between Tikal and Yucatan is one of those things that I actually can talk about in a little bit of detail, because even though we don't have a lot of pictorial representations of this battle, we know enough about the way that Maya conducted warfare to reconstruct what this epic struggle would have been like. One thing's clear. This battle would have been like anything that the seasoned warriors on either side had ever experienced. And for the people of Yucatan, it would have been utterly devastating. Now, believe it or not, for them it actually started okay. Their king had led his warriors through days of fasting, the rites of purification and sacrifice. Deep in the night with his own hands, he painted on the strong faces of his kinsmen. We have to imagine this flickering torchlight in a chambered hallway. He's adorning himself with black and red patterns that would terrify anyone. The king's principal wife, who was pregnant, we know, with their next child, had waited until the men of lesser status were prepared before she brought the king his battle gear. His second wife stood nearby holding their infant child, and his firstborn child by his principal wife watched the proceedings, a young boy with wide eyes. One day he, like his father, would lead his men into battle in defense of the portals of the sacred mountains, in defense of the ancestors. Dressed in full battle regalia, we have to imagine the king smiling at his son and leading his family out of the darkness of the Great Pyramid into the pre-dawn morning. In the still darkness, his warriors awaited him, already dressed, their battle jackets tied loosely across their muscled chests. When he appeared in flickering torchlight, they would have greeted him with a low-throated shout and began the last stage of preparation. They would have worn helmets emblazoned with the images of animal protectors. They would have worn fearsome god masks made in the image of the axe-wielding executioner and other lesser gods of the underworld. Then they would have draped the wizened, shrunken heads of now dead captives around their necks to let the enemy know that they faced seasoned men of high reputation and proven valor. Of course, then there would have been the rush of fear and anticipation of glory as the warriors of Yucatán reached the open savanna south of the city. There, the battle would be fought against the age-old rivals of Tikal, who lived among the swamps to the south, the right hand of the sun. The warming light of the rising sun burns away the mists of the ground to reveal the warriors arrayed in a tension-filled stillness. The battle would have begun in the old ways. Standing in the waist-high grass, the old men sounded the great wooden trumpets, whose piercing song cut through the brass thunder of great war drums. The king's people stood together, like a writhing vision of multicolored glory against the green of those trees, shouting the usual insults about the ancestry of their Tikal enemy. One after another, some singly, some probably in groups, his Ahuab shouted their challenges toward their counterparts across the savannah, charging into the open battleground between, again, you just have to imagine this is so similar to the Iliad in so many ways. They would have screamed insults and then retreated back into the safety of their own side. Their bravado just ripples through the ranks, transforming everyone into a pulsating sea of hysterical faces, bodies trembling, tense for the final push. Then, with the tension literally unbearable, the warriors' rage would have exploded into a frenzied release. Both armies would have charged across the grass, trampling it under their thudding feet. It emerged, meeting in the middle of the field, in a screaming discharge of energy, two forces just crashing and crunching into one another. Blades of obsidian clashing against woven shields in a glorious and dangerous hunt for captives. Remember, the goal isn't to kill, the goal is to capture and give these people as gifts to the god. The line struck, and the chaos would have been almost incomprehensible. There was a brief flare of victory as Yucatan's surging mass of men flowed across the field, sweeping first toward the clump of men who protected the leader of the other army, great Jaguar Paw, Tikal's high king, and then bathed northward. The entangled horde of men finally separated, and the exhausted warriors, as would have been the case in any medieval battle, fell back toward the safety of their own side to regroup. Many would have needed to wet their throats with water, or bind up wounds with strips of paper. Some of the warriors had already been taken captive, and some had taken captives. These men had to be stripped naked and tied down before they could escape in the heat of the confusion of the battle. With the great numbers involved here, there's every certainty that this battle would have lasted all day. And then things changed. It was then that the treacherous enemy lord struck. Smoking Frog, the war chief of Tikal's army, flashed an unseen signal from the forest, and out came hundreds of hidden warriors. In an eerie silence, never once issuing a challenge, for the first time ever, they hurled a cloud of spears into the thick ranks of the Yucatán warriors. Shocked and horrified, the opposing king realized that the enemy was using spear throwers, the hunter's weapon, killing his people like food animals gathered for the slaughter. The surprise of the attack was too great, and many of the best warriors of Yucatán fell to the flying lances, unable to move to safety in time. Many died, and many more were crippled by a weapon the king had never before seen used in a Maya war. Foreigners who had come to their lands, placed from Tenochtitlan, the great capital of the far west, they used these. But not in the Yucatan Peninsula. The hidden hundreds of Tikal's militia advanced and advanced and advanced, all carrying bunches of light obsidian-tipped darts and throwing sticks, so would have pierced any armor that the Yucatan warriors wore. The king would have heard one of his kingsmen maybe scream as a spear drove straight through his cheek. Shouting his hatred for the enemy, the king and the captains leaped forward in one last charge towards the Tikal general Smoking Frog, where he stood at the far end of the field, jamming a wedge of bloody spears through the twisting bodies of Tikal's young men. The warriors of Yucatan would have torn a pathway through the enemy ranks towards the vengeful king, but it was too late. Like a last charge, it didn't work. Tikal's triumph was complete. More spears rained down, and the king of Yucatan was forced to pull back to the forest with the shattered remnant of his army. But this wasn't over. Also, for the first time, a new unthinkable disaster was about to befall the people of Yucatan. As that king retreated, he would have looked back and seen Tikal's forces behind him, at his heels. In spite of all their efforts, Smoking Frog and his company swirled around the base of the king's pyramid, killing and capturing the valiant warriors of now the Yucatan Royal High Clan. The king and his men would have fought to the very last. At the moment of his capture, the king of Yucatan, I do have an image of this, reached furiously for Smoking Frog's throat. Laughing, in the images we have, the Tikal lord merely jerks him to his knees by his long bound hair. The defeated king glared up. The war was over. All would die. There would be no ransom. Under the code of this new foreign battle strategy, Smoking Frog would be able to bring his own Tikal ancestors to the portal of Yucatan. It would be him and his descendants who would rule not only the people of the city, but their venerated ancestors as well. It was a war of audacity, beyond imagination. War to take not only the king, but also the portal to his ancestors, to the underworld. For now, Smoking Frog was the king of Yucatan. This is really the only battle that we get of great description from the entire Maya period. Every battle before tends to follow the sort of same style. It's just an effort to take captive. In this battle, it's clear that the stakes have risen. The goal is no longer just captives. The goal is to seize control of the territory. And this is when we see the Maya civilization enter the classic period from which we'll get all the great city-states that will rule. After the conquest, Smoking Frog becomes, I guess, what we would call the governor of Yucatan. We're reasonably sure he never ruled the city-state as an independent king. And this is why we believe that he was related to Great Jaguar Paw. The war was hugely consequential for the region that is today Guatemala and southern Mexico. Tikal, due to its military dominance, would go on to rule the region for 180 years. What is more interesting is that there's a ton of evidence during this period of a growing link between the Maya and the people who will become the Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico. Conquest was nothing new for the Aztecs, and yes, I know the term is not 100% correct, but I haven't yet really introduced the Aztecs, so I'm using the term here for simplicity. But conquest was new for the Maya, and so the kingdom of Tikal became the largest and most prosperous Maya city-state throughout the classical period, which began in 250 Common Era and lasted until about the year 500. Sadly, Most of the archaeological evidence for Tikal has been destroyed, first by other Mayan kingdoms, and later by the conquering Spanish. As a result, piecing together the kingdom's history is nearly impossible, at least from a traditional narrative sense. We have a list of rulers, but we know next to nothing about them. The only mark they left on Tikal is visible in the form of magnificent ruins. Tikal itself lasted as a kingdom until the mid-6th century, when it was overtaken by the neighboring city of Karakal. Beginning in the early 6th century, Tikal and Karakal fought a series of wars for dominance in the region. By the mid-7th century, Karakal had completed its subjugation of Tikal and now ruled. But Karakal did not incorporate Tikal into any sort of empire. Karakal remained what I guess we would call old school throughout its history. It attempted to influence the political life of its neighbors without ever ruling them directly, sort of a soft colonial approach. By around 680, however, Tikal was back on the rise, and by 700 was back on top. The machinations of how all that happened are much less interesting, and we're also much less sure about them, than if we just back up for a second and look at the bigger picture. The Ahau of Tikal, Karakal, and several other city-states in the region were related by blood more often than not. Generally, this was because one city-state wanted a marriage alliance with another. The consequence of all this, though, was to actually make the entire system more fragile. Rather than securing peace, these marriage alliances tended to pull the various city-states into competition with one another. The nobility was always more focused on the larger cosmic implications of their relationship. To them, the rise and fall of different city-states was less important than the cycles of the stars and the role of the Ahau within this cosmic system. For the nobility, as well as for the Maya people, to be Maya was to be part of the patterns of history formed by the actions of the kings within the framework of sacred space and sacred time. These were truly the original Star Wars. Today, the Usumacinta River forms the border between Guatemala and Mexico. There, in the 8th century CE, at a horseshoe bend in the river, sat the Maya city of Yaxchiclan. Yaxchiclan was a city of gleaming white stone, set against the verdant background of the lush green jungle beyond. Between 681 CE and 771, a father and son duo, shield jaguar and bird jaguar, built up Yaxchiclan to become the dominant power in the region for a time. In fact, these two were so successful that shield jaguar and bird jaguar were actually the first two Maya names to come down to us when the sources were rediscovered. Most of shield jaguar's life remains unknown to this day, though we do know he became Ahau at just 11 years of age. Shield jaguar seems to have been an accomplished warrior and very prolific in the marriage bed. By the time of his death in his mid-90s, he apparently had scores of children and grandchildren. It took bird jaguar, his son, 10 years just to defeat all his rivals to the throne. Once he did, bird jaguar immediately launched an aggressive series of wars against his rivals. While these wars are far too remote to be of any interest to us, what is interesting is why bird jaguar did all this. He did it because he wanted legitimacy. Taking captives in war was a way to both please the gods and secure the legitimacy of a new king. If a Mayan king took a high-ranking captive in battle, then his right to rule was beyond question. This is what bird jaguar was after. Meanwhile, in the Copan Valley in modern-day Honduras, another Mayan city-state was on the rise. The Copan Valley is a rich, fertile region and was the perfect place to support higher density populations. Curiously, the region seems to have suffered through a period of inexplicable decline between 300 and 150 CE, but turned the corner thereafter. Archaeologists have no explanation for said decline, but by 200 CE, the Copan Valley had recovered. There was an abundance of farmland for the relative paucity of people, and the population grew quickly. Soon, social standing became tied to one's proximity to the city center. The new urban elite established dense neighborhoods around the Acropolis, located at the heart of Copan. By 426 CE, Copan had an Oahu and everything else we would expect to see from a burgeoning Maya civilization. The dynasty established in the early 5th century CE ruled the valley for the next 400 years. During the late classical period, Copan initiated a series of wars against its neighbors that first went well but then later turned on it. The Ahau of Copan himself was captured in battle and ritualistically executed in 738 CE. But the fate of Copan was profoundly different from Tikal, illustrating again that there was no one-size-fits-all approach to war and politics in the Maya world. The population of Copan, despite all these military setbacks, continued to grow. Merchants continued to prosper. It was, in other words, business as usual. Hence, in the Maya world, even a major loss in battle did not necessarily mean a change in the political elite. But when most people hear the word Maya, they think of Chichen Itza. It's a little ironic, therefore, that the empire of Chichen Itza only developed in the late classical period, as Maya civilization was declining. By and large, the reasons for this decline are obvious. The endemic warfare between the different city-states finally took too much of a toll on the Mayan people. The only region where this was not the case was in the dry forest lands of the northern Yucatan. There, not only did the Maya persist, but they flourished. Now, the cultures of the northern Yucatan were distinct in many ways from that of their southern brethren. They developed a historic tradition of their own, collected in books called the Chilambalam. They developed their own architecture techniques, using concrete core structures faced with block masonry. But still, the Mayan peoples of the north and south share a common heritage. What really happened in the late classic period was that the northerners diverged while the southerners collapsed. In the north, the people saw the never-ending wars to the south and reimagined the role of the Ahau to try and prevent such a blight from reaching them. Chichen Itza was an empire state. It was a state based on conquest and the subjugation of its rivals. At its height, everyone in Mesoamerica knew the name Chichen Itza. And within Chichen Itza itself, and this is still the case today, the massive pyramid named the Castillo, by the Spanish, obviously, towers above all else. The rulers of Chichen Itza decided that they would carve their exploits into the very stone of their monumental buildings. Everyone that way would know of their glory. It took years, we don't know exactly how long, but in the end, the rulers of Chichen Itza triumphed over the other major city in the region, Coba. Coba probably had the larger population, but its armies lost nevertheless, and found itself incorporated into the Chichen Empire. Success bred success, and eventually the Ahau of Chichen Itza found themselves ruling a commercially dominant state. Chichen Itza left us a written history, but it's remarkably short for a city-state that lasted for hundreds of years. And its written history is also pretty enigmatic and difficult to read. For example, we're given the names of the Ahau, but they're not told where they were born died, or even when they ruled. So piecing together a narrative of the history of Chichen Itza is all but impossible. It is interesting for more reasons than that its buildings survived, however. In Chichen Itza, the Ahau practiced a form of power sharing that we just don't see in the other Maya kingdoms. More likely than not, the Ahau shared power with his family members. The Maya had a word for this kind of government, multepao, which means joint or confederate government. The images that we get show multitudes of people seated on thrones together. The main throne in these images is often portrayed as empty. This is an important symbolic gesture. In Chichen Itza, the government itself, not a real individual, was what mattered. It's a lot like how in the United States today, the government is embodied not in a person, but in the Constitution, an idea about what the government should be. The biggest change that the rulers of Chichen Itza adopted was a transformation in the purpose of war. They got rid of the blood feud as the driving impetus for conflict. That primarily was what drove the southern Maya to extinction. Instead, the rulers of Chichen Itza adopted a more rational approach to war. The goal was no longer endless bloodshed, eye for an eye justice. Now the goal was to achieve stability. That meant alliances based on mutual benefit, not on the uncertainties of marriage. And you know what? It worked. At its height, Chichen Itza ruled the entire Mayan lowlands. Its expansion was regular, and by the time that the Spaniards arrived, there was evidence that they must have created a truly astounding civilization. Sadly, Chichen Itza would prove to be the last great Maya city-state. When those aforementioned Spaniards arrived, it was to marvel, as I said, but it was to marvel at ruins. While the nobles and kings shared power for a time, most historians believe that after 900 CE, that arrangement had lost its luster. Slowly but surely, as power fractured, it became harder and harder for the Maya to marshal the necessary resources needed to build their pyramids and tame the jungle. Eventually, the jungle won. Maya cities were overgrown, literacy forgotten, and faded into the mists of history. That is truly the great tragedy of Chichen Itza. It was undoubtedly the greatest Mayan state, but we know next to nothing about it because those Maya wrote little down, or at least very little of it survived. Without documents, we cannot precisely say how the Maya met their final end. Was there a great final conflict? Or like so many former empires, did the Maya go out with a whimper rather than a bang? We may never know. Technically, the final king of the Maya met and interacted with the Spanish in 1525. But by then, the Maya world was well and truly over. I do really wish that we could say more about the Maya, because I bet they have a fascinating narrative history. But so much of it is bits and pieces that trying to string together a comprehensive narrative proved too difficult, at least for me, in this particular episode. So I wanted to give you an overview, but that's about the most I can give. Next time, we start moving more in the concrete direction. It's time to shift our focus to what is today Mexico and introduce the Aztecs, because they've got to flourish before a guy named Hernan Cortez shows up.